Amen. Thank you all. Appreciate that very much, and good to see everybody. Welcome this evening. I'm going to try to stick this in my pocket without turning it off this week. Very carefully. So far, so good. All right, that sounds good. So it's good to see everybody. Glad that you're here. You know, I've always thanked the Lord that He's let me live in Tennessee. Now, there were a few years that, you know, we were astray in some foreign territory called Georgia and Kentucky. Georgia was more foreign than Kentucky was, Southwest Georgia. But I'm really glad I'm in Tennessee right now, and I see what's going on out in the Southwest, all those hot weather, and we've at least got some rain. We've had quite a bit of rain, but hey, we're in good shape. So it's good to see you. Glad to have you all with us. We're going to be in Judges chapter number 3 tonight. Judges 3. We're actually going to be getting into the Judges. We've spent a couple of times together in the early chapters of the book of Judges, setting the stage for what we're going to be getting into this evening. So we're going to be in Judges 3. A little bit of a review, okay, because it's been a couple of weeks since we met last. If you remember the first time we met, Judges chapter 1, we called it the prologue of Judges, because basically what the writer of Judges does, he starts out with a lot of material that we just had covered, some of the material we covered in the book of Joshua. And you're kind of like, well, wait a minute, here's Joshua and here's Judges, and we just covered all that. Why is the writer, the author of Judges, covering some of this stuff? Well, you got to remember that from the period of Joshua until the writing of the book of Judges, there was about 300 years in between there, okay? Samuel, more than likely, the Old Testament prophet and also last of the Judges, I believe is the author of Judges. So he was going back and he was rehearsing, kind of giving us that background like any good prologue does, setting the stage. Then in chapter 1, we actually got into, or chapter 2, I should say, we actually got into the study of, or the introduction of the book of Judges, which basically begins to set the stage of saying to us that Israel begins falling away from God. There's a generation that has risen up that did not know Joshua nor the elders of Joshua's day. And I think, you know, and I hear that, and you think, well, how does that happen? How do you have these great things that God did in Joshua's life and that generation of Jews and those elders, and how do you end up a couple of decades or so, you know, century or so on down the road, and there's this generation that doesn't know? I'll tell you how I think it happens. Two things. There's the influence of culture, which certainly had a whole lot to do with that generation, and we see the result of that in the book of Judges. And we're going to talk about this tonight. We've mentioned this over and over again throughout the book of Joshua. God was saying, remember, you got to drive these pagans out. You got to cleanse the land. You got to get them out of here. Because if you don't, they're going to be a stumbling block. They're going to be a thorn in your flesh. And as a result of that, you're going to end up following their ways. And we see that that happens, all right? So that's one piece. I think another piece of the puzzle is very relevant to our day and age, because we kind of ask this question. I had a conversation with some folks just this afternoon about young adults raised in Christian homes and who, on the one hand, they believe this, they say they believe, but yet lifestyle and practice doesn't necessarily always fit up. So there's the influence of culture there too, all right? I also think, and this is not to say in every situation, but even back in the days of Joshua and Judges, to that generation that did not know the Lord, I think there was a breakdown in the transmission of the faith from one generation to another. I think that's a huge part of what's going on in America today, that there has been a breakdown in the transmission of the faith from one generation or earlier generations to subsequent generations. Way too often we as Christian parents have become so dependent on the church to transmit the information that we've not been really as engaged ourselves in making sure that transmission happens. I think that was going on back in the post-Joshua era leading up to Judges. I think it's got a whole lot to do with where we are today as well. And so then when we get all the way through chapter 2 with that introductory piece, and we begin seeing this pattern that starts to develop, this downward cycle, and we'll see it going throughout the book of Judges. Then we come down to verses 1 through 4. And I want you to look at verses 1 through 4 of chapter 3 again, because here's what we're told. Actually, the latter part of chapter 2, beginning at verse number 20, all right? Then the anger of the Lord was hot against Israel, and he said, because this nation has transgressed my covenant, which I commanded their fathers, and has not heeded my voice, he says, I will no longer drive out from before them any of the nations which Joshua left when he died. See, the job wasn't sufficiently done even in Joshua's day of driving the Canaanites out, cleansing the land. And then God had told the individual tribes, remember? All right, now you have had your land given to you. Now it's your responsibility, you and your tribe, your people, it's your responsibility to go in and inhabit that particular piece of property and drive out the inhabitants. They didn't do it. And so now it comes down, or at least let me say this, they didn't do their part. They could not have done it on their own entirely. They had to depend upon the Lord to drive out those inhabitants, but they did not do their part. Oftentimes they didn't even put forth the effort. And so as a result, you come down to verse number 22, where God says to them, so now I will not drive them out. I'm not going to do it for you. There's a lesson for us right there. Sometimes we pray, God do this, God do that. And God, I believe, is willing. But oftentimes we've got our part to do, and we don't want to do our part. We're wanting God to do it all. That's kind of where Israel was. And now God says, no. Now I'm not going to drive these people out. Verse 22, so that through them I may test Israel, whether they will keep the ways of the Lord to walk in them as their fathers kept them or not. And therefore the Lord left those nations without driving them out immediately, nor did he deliver them into the hand of Joshua. So, then in verses 1 through 4, you go through a list of the various nations, Canaanite peoples that were left in the land, which leads us to verse 5 of chapter 3, because here's where we are introduced to the beginning of this cycle in the book of Judges of this unfaithfulness and deliverance. Verse 5, thus the children of Israel dwelt among the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hittites, and the Jebusites. And then verse 6 says, and they took their daughters to be their wives, and they gave their daughters to their sons, and they served their gods. And so now here's what happens. Now not only are these pagans still in the land, now Israel's starting to commingle with them. They're intermarrying with them. Boy, let me tell you something. You want to talk about something that'll start showing the results of influence? You just wait until this one marries this one from over there and they get together and you start seeing all kinds of dynamics going on of different kinds of influence that wives have on husbands, husbands have on wives, depending on where they're coming from. That starts right here. And then that leads us to our first judge. All right, in your outline, I have on there Judge Othniel, okay, beginning in verse number 7. So remember, this sin of intermarriage, New Testament version, Paul's writing, do not be unequally yoked. What does light have to do with darkness? What does Christ have to do with Belial, the devil? Okay? Don't be unequally yoked. And that's what's happening here. You've got supposedly worshipers of Yahweh, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, marrying the worshipers of Baal and Ashtoreth and so forth and so on. Well, you know, that's bound to be, and here's a principle. Here's a principle that you find. Darkness always spreads faster than light when you're talking about in the spiritual realm. Evil spreads faster than goodness. You know why? Because our human natures are prone towards darkness and evil. So that leads us to Othniel, all right? Here's what we read, beginning in verse number 7. So the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord. So who do you think had the most influence? The people of God or the people of the pagans? The pagans had the greater influence, okay? The children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord. They forgot the Lord their God, and they served the Baals and the Asherahs, which is another term. Last time we were looking at it was Ashtaroth. They're interchangeable terms. Remember, they are the gods of the fertility cults, all right? So as a result of the chastisement that came upon Israel was that they were made to serve the king of Mesopotamia. And so we read in verse number 8, it says, therefore the anger of the Lord was hot against Israel, and he sold them into the hand of Cushan Rishathaim, is how you pronounce that, okay? Say that 3 or 4 times real fast, all right? He sold them into the hand of Cushan Rishathaim, king of Mesopotamia, and the children of Israel served Cushan 8 years. Now, this name, Cushan Rishathaim, okay, more than likely, here's what's believed. It's believed that that's not the proper name of this king. It is a name, more than likely, that the Israelites tagged him with. Because here's what it means. It means Cushan of double wickedness. In other words, it's saying he was a very, very wicked man. He was a wicked king. Now you got to remember something. We're talking about this. We're starting to talk about the first of the judges, Othniel. All right? So this is the first episode of this cycle that unfortunately is going to be repeated over and over again. Here's what I think God was doing. I think what God was doing is this. He has seen all this developing. He says, okay, there's only one way for me to get their attention. I'm going to have to basically let them become in servitude, slaves, under the foot of one of these pagan kings and rulers, and let them suffer some consequences for their decision, and maybe they'll cry out to me and turn to me. And I believe that this was a national oppression. Well, here's what you find in the book of Judges. In many, in fact, most of the judges, when it says they delivered Israel, it was more on a regional effect. Regions, okay? I believe this was a national oppression. Why do I say that? Because it's the first time that God is allowing Israel to go through this. I believe he's trying to get the attention of the entire nation. Plus, think about this. Look at who it is that has become the oppressor. The king of Mesopotamia. All right? Now, you're not talking about just some little fledgling empire, although it's not the empire that it maybe once had been or that it would become someday. But for a king of a kingdom of that magnitude to just have a little regional dispute doesn't make sense. I think God brought the big guns right out of the bat to try to get Israel's attention. So the entire nation is oppressed by this king of Mesopotamia. Okay? Meaning that Othniel, the first judge, was also a national leader. In other words, his responsibility was to help bring the entire nation out from under this bondage. But I want you to look at something. Notice, if you would, in the latter part of verse number 8, how many years did they serve Cushan? 8 years. 8 years. It took them 8 years of suffering with his foot basically on their neck for them to finally come to the place where they say, you know what? We would be better off seeking the Lord than... But it took them 8 years. Now, you know people as well as... You know people that you've looked at them and you've said, look at the mess that their life is in. And they live for sometimes decades like that. It's amazing how hard the human heart can be, how stubborn we can be. So verse number 9 says this: so when the children of Israel cried out to the Lord raised up a deliverer for the children of Israel, who delivered them, Othniel, the son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother. Now, we've heard of him before. We heard of him in the book of Judges, remember? Caleb claimed his land, and then there was a particular city that there was a stronghold there, and Caleb said, whoever comes up and conquers this, I'm going to give them my daughter to be their wife. And this young man stepped up. This young man, so he became Caleb's son-in-law. Even before he became his son-in-law, he was already his nephew. He was the son of Caleb's younger brother, okay? And here's the thing. So it seems that Othniel was held in high regard. He's mentioned in Joshua. He's mentioned again in Joshua chapter 1 during the rehearsal of those days here in the book of Judges. And did you know that there are actually some legends about Othniel? There was a man by the name of Louis Ginsburg. He put together a book entitled The Legends of the Jews. There's some legends that were created around Othniel. Here are a couple of them. It says this, first of all, quote, among the judges, Othniel represents the class of scholars. So maybe he was considered to be a very intelligent man. Says this, his acumen was so great that he was able, by dint of dialect reasoning, isn't that a mouthful? Dint of dialect reasoning. I'm not even sure what that means. I think it's supposed to mean he was a smart guy, all right? He was able, by dint of dialect reasoning, to restore, listen to this, to restore the 1,700 traditions which Moses had taught the people and which had been forgotten in the time of mourning for Moses. So all these 1,700 traditions had been forgotten, but Othniel had such a dint of dialectic reasoning that he of his own accord was able to restore all 1,700. Here's another one. Othniel, however, was held in so little answerable, this language, Othniel, however, was held so little answerable for the causes that had brought on the punishment of the people that God granted him eternal life. He is one of the few who reached paradise alive. Now, those are all legends that were built. But here's the thing. I think one of the things that what it indicates is that Othniel was a man who was held in high regard. Okay? Now, have you ever seen, and if you've not watched some of these, the ESPN 30 for 30 documentaries. Have you ever seen the one entitled "You Don't Know Bo: The Legends of Bo Jackson"? Have you ever seen it? It's phenomenal. It is absolutely phenomenal. The thing about it is, these legends are true. If you had never watched it, you ought to watch it. It's pretty good, okay? But the legends here about Othniel, not so much, okay? They're just legends. Verse number 10, here's the thing that really matters about Othniel. Look at this. The Spirit of the Lord came upon him, and he judged Israel. Now, we really don't know, other than what we've talked about here, and like I said, the legends, that's just kind of entertaining stuff. That's not really true. So we don't really know a whole lot about Othniel, other than the fact I think it is true. I believe he was held in high regard. But we know what matters most about him. And it's what we have right here in front of us. The Spirit of the Lord came upon him, and he judged. Here's the thing about Othniel. First judge. He lived and served by Zechariah 4:6. Not by might, nor by power, but by my Spirit, says the Lord. And by the way, here's the thing, and I've read this in a couple of different commentators who've said the same thing. I first had this impression myself about this, but I thought, well, let me do some more reading, and this was confirmed. Othniel's the first judge. This is the first time that God's having to deal with this situation with Israel in this particular matter, okay? The whole nation is under the foot of this pagan king. Othniel's the one who's raised up. Othniel, listen to this, Othniel becomes the standard, in a sense, by which all other judges would to be judged themselves. Or in other words, he was kind of setting the standard of the kind of character and the kind of man, and the fact that he is a spirit-empowered man. He kind of becomes the template for what all other judges should seek to live up to. It goes on and says, verse number 10, and he went out to war, and the Lord delivered Cushan, king of Mesopotamia, into his hand, and his hand prevailed over Cushan, and so the land had rest for 40 years. Then Othniel, the son of Kenaz, died. Which brings us to the second judge, Ehud. Now, remember, the downward cycle. It continues. As Israel is again sold into servitude for their sin. And by the way, we saw that word a few minutes ago, early on in the verses we were reading over there about Othniel, how the Lord sold them into the hand of the king of Mesopotamia. Now that word sold doesn't necessarily mean the idea of selling in exchange for cash or gold. It means like, it actually is used like, as in giving in marriage. Giving away in marriage. Putting under the power and the authority of another. Okay? That's what God did with his own people. He sold them. He gave them away and put them under the power of another. We have the same thing going on here. Verse 12. Again, and the children of Israel again did evil in the sight of the Lord. So the Lord strengthened Eglon, king of Moab, against Israel, because they had done evil in the sight of the Lord. Then he gathered to himself the people of Ammon and Amalek, and defeated Israel and took possession of the city of palms. So the children of Israel served Eglon, king of Moab, 18 years. We don't have our map out or anything, but let me kind of give you an idea what we're talking about. So if you're looking at a map of Israel, remember we've got the Transjordan on the east, and we've got Palestine on the west of the Jordan, okay? On the east, we've got 3 tribes. On the west, we have the other tribes settled, okay? You've got the Sea of Galilee up north. The River Jordan flows down southward into the Dead Sea, kind of on the western, eastern border of Judah, all right? Remember, Judah is the big tribe down in the southern part of Israel. Moab would have been located just to the west of the Dead Sea. So if you're in Judah, you come down to the Dead Sea. On the west side is where Moab was located, all right? Ammon, who's mentioned here, was located just north of Moab. So almost like you'd kind of cross over the Jordan River and you could move right towards Ammon. Amalek, the Amalekites, were located down deep in the southern part below Judah. All right? Here's my point. God gives Israel into the hand of Eglon, the Moabite, but he also brings with him the Amalekites and the Ammonites. So essentially, you've got three different people. Eglon's in charge, but he's got these other three peoples and nations that are with him, okay? And so Israel's sin brings them into bondage to this king by the name of Eglon. And notice, if you would, the latter part of verse number 14 says this: so the children of Israel served Eglon, king of Moab, how many years? 18. Now, how many years did it take for them to finally cry out to God when they were under the foot of the king of Mesopotamia? 8. This time it takes 18 years of living under the foot of Eglon and these others. Can you say stubbornness? Talk about stubborn. And so it finally takes them 18 years to come around and say, you know, I think we'd be better off with the Lord than we would in this situation. Amazing how stubborn and hard the human heart can be, isn't it? Now, so here's a point for us to consider, and that is this: sin always brings bondage. I know of Christians who said, oh, you know, I committed this sin, I did this, whatever, you know, nothing's happened. Did you know that even that attitude right there is a form of bondage? Because what it's making you, what makes us do is it makes us think, we become indifferent. We become careless. We become flippant about it. And if I get away with this, then I think I can get away with that. And then it keeps going and going until eventually you're caught in the snare. And sin always comes with some level or by some level of deception. Always remember that. That person who's saying, I committed this sin or that sin, nothing happened, there's a level of deception right there. I mean, that's proof in and of itself. Verse 15. But when the children of Israel cried out to the Lord raised up a deliverer for them, Ehud, the son of Gera, the Benjamite, a left-handed man. Now, let me ask you a question. Why does Samuel specifically mention that Ehud, who is the judge that has been raised up, that he's a left-handed man? What difference? You know, if you did that today, you'd get called up for being prejudicial and, you know, judging somebody. Why did he talk about the fact that he's a left-handed man? Any idea?
Well, it turns out to be an attribute for him.
It does, but why? If he had been right-handed, do you think that Samuel, the author, would have mentioned it? No. Here's the reason why he mentions it. To the Israelites, they believed that being left-handed was a defect. Most everyone in that culture, if you were left-handed, you were forced to conform and become right-handed. Now, you think from an Israelite point of view, when the scriptures talk about God's might and his strength, how is it oftentimes described? His mighty right hand. Okay? So to the Israelites, to be left-handed was defective. But here's an interesting thing. Ehud is from the tribe of Benjamin. And oddly enough, a very common trait among the Benjamites is that in their DNA, they were left-handed. And so it's interesting that here he is, that he has not been forced to conform to become a right-handed person, because it's going to prove to be a tremendous asset to him on the mission that's before him. It goes on and says this: by him the children of Israel sent tribute to Eglon, the king of Moab. Now, Ehud made himself a dagger. It was double-edged and a cubit in length. Now, if you've ever seen a dagger is made in a very unique design, okay? Sharp point, beveled edges, sharp edge, and so forth. And it says that this particular double-edged dagger was a cubit in length. Now, you know how long a cubit is? Yep. Right here. Elbow, tip of the finger. I measured it today, right at 18 inches, all right? That's called a common cubit. Now, there was such a thing as a royal cubit, which was approximately 24 inches. But a common cubit was from elbow, tip of the finger. So you think, that's a knife. Yeah, like the guy said in the movie, that's a knife. You know what I mean? So that's a knife. And it is shaped as a dagger. It's a killing tool, okay? It's not made for whittling, all right? It's made for killing. And it goes on and says, so he makes this double-edged dagger, a cubit in length, and he fastened it under his clothes on his right thigh. Why? When you're going to reach for a sword or something like that, you don't have, this is what you want. Okay? Opposite. You can draw, reach it much easier. Here's another reason why that is strategic. Remember, the mindset is we're all right-handed. If he's coming in with a dagger and they're patting him down, guess what side they would be suspicious of? Left side, not the right. So he comes in with that dagger on his left thigh, okay, under his clothing. So he brought the tribute to Eglon, the king of Moab. Now remember, what is tribute? It's a gift, but it's a gift by force. It's a tax, okay? It is a way of that king who has authority over you to remind you, you're my lesser, you're my servant, you're subservient to me. I take what is yours, and it belongs to me, okay? And so he goes in, he takes the tribute to the king, to Eglon, the king of Moab, verse 18. But here's another thing too. It's also a sure way of getting audience with a king. Eglon has not met the king before. Verse 18. And when he had finished presenting the tribute, he sent away the people who had carried the tribute. So obviously it's pretty considerable. It took other people to help pack it. But he himself turned back to go and see the king, Eglon, from the stone images that were at Gilgal. So, there again, I don't have the map with me tonight. But if you remember, in the tribal allotments, remember that Ephraim, their allotment was right in the very center of the west side, remember? So, and just below that was Benjamin. So in order for them to get to Moab, here's what they had to do. They had to travel west. They went past Gilgal. All right, remember what's the significance of Gilgal from the book of Joshua? Remember? It's where they initially set up camp. It's where they erected those memorial stones from the river. So they would have traveled past Gilgal, going westward. Then they would have turned to the south, and they would have gone down to Moab, okay? So Ehud and those accompanying him have been down to Moab. They've given the tribute to the king. They have traveled back north to Gilgal. Ehud says to them, you guys go on home. I'm going to go back. I need to go back and talk to the king. I've got a special message for him. Okay? That's what's going on. And he said to the king, when he returns, I have a secret message for you, O king. And he, the king, said, keep silence. And all who attended him went out from him. And so Ehud came to him. Now he was sitting upstairs in his cool private chamber. So you know what that indicates? This is summertime. Because he's in the part of the chamber that would have been the coolest, which is where they spent their time in the summer. Then Ehud said, I have a message from God for you. So he arose from his seat. Can you see that, this picture? Here's the king. He's sitting on his throne up there in the chilling room. He comes up and says, I got a message from God. Oh, he even stands up for this. Says, oh, come on, son, tell me, what is the message? And so he stands up. He arose from his seat. Then Ehud reached with his left hand, took the dagger from his right thigh, and he thrust it into his belly. Even the hilt went in after the blade, and the fat closed over the blade, for he did not draw the dagger out of his belly, and his entrails came out. Eglon was a fat man, and he went in deep, all the way. Now that's a real, and it says his entrails fell out. That is an image that'll bless your heart, right? F.B. Meyer makes some comments on that statement, I have a message for you from God. Here's what he says. God's messages are often secret, or they're given in private. God's messages must be received with reverence. God's messages leap out from unexpected quarters. God's messages are as sharp as a two-edged sword and cause death. You think, wow, that's kind of strange. But then he goes on and says this. God's word pierces as a two-edged sword to the dividing of the soul and spirit and the recesses of the being, and is a discerner of the thoughts and intents of the heart. Book of Hebrews. Okay? But then he says this. Listen to this. When the Eglon of self has received its death wound, the glad trumpet of freedom is blown on the hills. You see, God's word is intended to be used in our life to help kill our old self, our flesh. And only until that old self is crucified and not allowed to control do we truly live. That's the point that Meyer is making. Verse 23, then Ehud went out through the porch and shut the doors of the upper room behind him and locked them. And when he had gone out, Eglon's servants came to look, and to their surprise, the doors of the upper room were locked. And so they said, he is probably attending to his needs in the cool chamber. In translation, he was sitting on that day's version of a porcelain throne. Okay? So they waited till they were embarrassed, and still he had not opened the doors of the upper room. And therefore they took the key and opened them, and there was their master fallen dead on the floor. But Ehud had escaped while they delayed, and passed beyond the stone images, in other words, that memorial that Joshua had set up in Gilgal. And it happened that when he arrived, he blew the trumpet in the mountains of Ephraim. The children of Israel went down with him from the mountains, and he led them. And then he said, follow me. And like any true leader, he was with his people leading the way, not saying, y'all go do, let's go together. For the Lord has delivered your enemies, the Moabites, into your hand. God gave them the victory. So they went down after him, seized the fords of the Jordan leading to Moab, and did not allow anyone to cross over. And at that time they killed about 10,000 men of Moab, all stout men of valor, not a man escaped. So Moab was subdued that day under the hand of Israel, and the land had rest for 80 years. So they were delivered. So that particular region, whatever part of Israel it was there that he was leading and helped deliver, for 80 years. It says they had rest, they remained faithful to the Lord for 80 years. But remember, what do we have going on in the book of Judges? A downward cycle. It just keeps happening. Last judge we'll talk about tonight is verse number 31, just one verse. Shamgar. And after him was Shamgar, the son of Anath, who killed 600 men of the Philistines with an ox goad, and he also delivered Israel. Just a note, Shamgar is one of 6 individuals, 6 judges that are oftentimes referred to as minor judges. So you have minor judges, major judges. You say, what's the difference? There's more detail to their story given if you're a major judge, like Ehud, Othniel, Samson, okay? Less information and detail given to a minor judge. But that doesn't mean that they are less important or what they did was not as important. It just means that there's just less information for whatever reason given to us. Just like minor prophets, major prophets. You've got Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, and then you've got the others that are minor prophets. Does that mean that the message of the majors are more important than the minor? No, it just means there's just a larger volume of material. That's the thing that makes the difference between them, okay? The great accomplishment of Shamgar is that he killed 600 men of the Philistines with an ox goad. You say, well, what in the world is an ox goad? An ox goad is a stick that is about 8 feet long. It's about 6 inches around. And on one end it has a point. It's used for prodding the ox. The other end is kind of flat, almost like a chisel, for scraping mud, stuff, debris, that sort of thing. But here's what Shamgar did. Shamgar took this 8-foot by 6-inch ox goad and took it from being a farming, herding implement and turned it into a weapon. Now you think about this, all right? Frank's a pretty good big guy there, okay? I've known Frank a long time. He's always been a big guy. Take an 8-foot by 6, turn that thing in and use it like a sword, like a weapon, some kind of baton. That takes quite a man. Just kind of gives you an idea of his ability to wield that thing and to use it effectively in killing the enemies of Israel. Here's the thing, what I say about Shamgar, he's almost a Samson-like character. Not entirely. There's differences, okay? But my point being is, it takes quite a bit of strength and coordination, skill to do that kind of thing. It's the sort of stuff that we kind of would associate with a Samson kind of person, okay? That ought to make you feel good, Frank, associated with Samson. But here's the thing. He delivered Israel, and I'll leave you this thought right here. Isn't it amazing how God can take even simple things and do great things with them? Even a man using an ox goad. All right, any questions, thoughts? Anybody? Comments? All right. We shall conclude. Thank you all so much for joining us online. Have a good evening. I'll turn it over to Brother Randy.